Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their recent or ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my great pleasure to meet and talk with Martin Bauch about his research into a global moment in the Middle Ages. Martin is a medievalist and climate historian with a geographical focus on Central and Mediterranean Europe. He did his doctoral studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin, gaining his PhD in medieval history at Darmstadt University of Technology. His thesis was on Emperor Charles IV and how he used piety and the veneration of relics for his own political ends. Between 2013 and 16, he was a postdoc at the German Historical Institute in Rome, and he is now a lecturer at the Leibniz Institute for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe in Leipzig. Notably, he has led a junior research group on comparative medieval climate history, financed as a Volkswagen Foundation Freigist Fellowship. He tells me he has a passion for volcanoes, the Mongols, and relics, and is trying to find a way to put all three of those passions into one academic paper. It will be very interesting to read when it happens. Martin, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Karen.
I've read some of your fascinating papers looking at the chronology and impact of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia in 1257. According to Wikipedia, probably in September of that year. In these papers, you look at the impact of food security all around the world. Please, can we start with the volcano? Accepting you are a climate historian and medievalist, and not a volcanologist or meteorologist, please, can you tell us roughly how the date of eruption was calculated, and what kind of eruption was it, and roughly how big? And given its location in Indonesia, how did it manage to impact Europe, China, and so many other places?
Yes, of course. How do we know about this eruption at all? So the written sources for Indonesia at that time are not dense enough that somebody would have noticed it. So basically, we know about this eruption from ice cores and from tree rings, because there is evidence of sulfate aerosols in polar ice cores from both poles, actually, and tree rings around the globe. So particularly cold years leave a specific mark in these tree rings, so-called frost rings. And these tree ring chronologies have been reconstructed mostly for the Northern Hemisphere. And in both these scientific kind of records, there was extraordinary markers in some parts of the ice cores or also in specific tree rings. Tree rings can be dated annually, quite precise. Ice cores can't be dated so well. So this is basically when we know that something happened in the middle of the 13th century. Must have been a large volcanic eruption. The precise dating, if you look very close to it, to what year exactly, then still the written sources, which are at the core of our work as historians, are key, because we have observations of strange atmospherical phenomena, indications of climatic extremes happening in these years. So this is basically the method why we know when that eruption should have happened. Indeed, volcanologists have been on the ground on that island next to Bali, Lombok, and they have found volcanic ash layers all across or large parts of the Indonesian islands. And then I could calculate and say, if ash of a specific eruption spreads like this, it must have been these and these wind conditions, probably in spring. So I would tend to disagree with Wikipedia. They say maybe April, May, but the year everybody or many people have agreed upon is 1257 for now. And if you want to know more about the eruption, what these colleagues have reconstructed is that it was a Plinian eruption, which means very explosive, referring to Pliny the Elder and the Vesuvius eruption, who is the first to describe such a kind of an event. We have to recall that volcanic eruptions can be very different. You have these explosive events, but you have also lava flows, but it's not explosive. It's not throwing the material up into the atmosphere. So what they have estimated about this specific eruption of a volcano called Samalas, not existing anymore, is that it must have been extremely explosive, probably the most explosive eruption in the last 2,000 years. And the material from the volcano thrown into the atmosphere is estimated, this column of the eruption reached up to 40 kilometers, which is a lot compared to more normal eruptions, which may be 4 or 5 kilometers. But if it's 40 kilometers high, as they have estimated, it would leave the troposphere and go up into the stratosphere, which starts at 12, 13 kilometers. And once the material, which is mainly sulfur and other elements, this huge cloud of material, they could be up to 40 cubic kilometers of material. Part of it reaches that higher part of the stratosphere and then spreads around the globe in the next months and remains there for maybe up to 3 years. That's the standard estimation, how long this can influence the global climate. And it influences global climate, especially by the sulfur. Sulfur is the material you can really trace in the ice cores. So in these very fine particles, these aerosols, are partially blocking sunlight. They probably influence precipitation patterns. And that is why such an event can influence climate, not in the same way everywhere, but on a global scale. And of course, there's also volcanic glass sherds, very fine ones in these particle clouds. And they have a very specific chemical signature. And that's how, in the end, one could analyze the situation on Lombok, on the Indonesian island, and say, okay, this sulfate in our polar ice cores must be from that specific volcano. That's how in 2012, I think, a French volcanologist could finally solve this event, which was before that known as the 13th century mystery eruption.
Martin, you're in northern Germany, which is not known for its volcanoes. What prompted your interest in volcanoes, ancient volcanoes, and on the other side of the world?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I see myself as a climate historian and medievalist. So if you're interested in historical climate change in the pre-industrial period, then volcanic eruptions are a big thing because they are the most influential climate drivers in pre-industrial climate. So you sooner or later will see these years which are normally associated with some volcanic eruption. And I did work on other eruptions before in the 15th century. As a medievalist, I was reading chronicles, in that case, a southern German chronicle. And this chronicle was describing what they saw. And they saw the sun turning blue for days, green, haze in the air, reduced sunshine, reduced crop growth. And a very detailed description, which I found there. And then I wanted to understand the background, the mechanism behind this effect, and then you come up with volcanoes at some point. I started to interest myself in medieval global history, and my approach is, if there is something truly global in the Middle Ages, it's of course the environment, or especially climate, because there's a natural accelerated climate change and climatic extremes in the Middle Ages. Often it's related to volcanoes, not all the time, but often. So that's where my interest in volcanoes developed. But maybe I'm also too much fascinated with disaster, as my wife says. So it's just, well, everybody likes disaster movies. I like disaster movies, put it like this. And then it's just a fascinating aspect. It went so far that we did a holiday in Indonesia in 2018, and we're of course on Lombok too, and I wanted to climb that volcano, which is no longer there, but what remains of it. We couldn't do it for some health issues. Luckily, I have to say, because I worked on disasters for years, and then when we couldn't climb and we had to cancel our tour, there was a major earthquake. People on the volcano actually got injured, so I'm quite happy we couldn't climb it in this situation. And I have to say, experiencing a disaster myself, I prefer to work on it. It was quite intimidating.
Well, you've got the perfect excuse to go back to Indonesia now.
It's still on the list.
In your papers, you mentioned that parts of Central Europe were less affected by this poor weather and poor harvest than other parts of Europe, notably Bohemia, the Baltic states, Poland, and Hungary. As I was reading it, I was wondering, did these areas actually have better weather, or was it simply not such good records?
Well, as everybody working on Eastern Central Europe in that time knows, the documentation isn't as detailed as you might wish at times. But I don't think this is the whole explanation to it, because I actually tried to make a comparative analysis of the agricultural impact of the event. We have to keep in mind, of course, that the meteorological and in consequence an agricultural impact of these volcanic eruptions can be different from region to region. So we shouldn't expect rain, cold summers everywhere. That's not how this happens. Also today, climate change is not the same in every region, obviously. But I found these periods of extreme dearth and famine almost everywhere, in England, in France, in the Mediterranean area, in the Middle East, in Japan, and nothing maybe east of the Elbe, from where Eastern Central Europe starts for me. And it's not just a lack of chronicles. How do I know? I think for two reasons. First, when you work as a climate historian, you try to take advantage of scientific data as well. And then we have also tree rings, which can reconstruct precipitation or temperatures. And there are some interesting reconstructions for the High Tatra Mountains, so which gives you some idea about conditions in Eastern Central Europe. While in most parts of Europe, these years in questions are extremely cold, in Eastern Europe, they're not so extraordinary. So this is a first hint. And then there is a second thing. I tried to work on other volcanic eruptions as well, and the best known volcanic eruption is not in the Middle Ages, but in the beginning of the 19th century, the Tambora eruption in 1815, followed by the so-called year without a summer, 1816. After that volcanic eruption, also from an Indonesian volcano, not so far from the Samalas, which I'm working on. While in Western Europe, Southern Europe, you have severe problems, real problems with harvests. Eastern Europe is not negatively affected, for some reasons positively. And they have grain harvests, and they export a lot of grain to the rest of Europe to keep them fed, basically. So we see this so-called year without a summer is not happening like that in Eastern Europe. As paleoclimatologists and volcanologists have looked on different eruptions over the centuries, they see something like a specific effect. They can't explain it why, but they see the effect that in the first year after the eruption on northern Eurasia, there is a kind of warming, not a cooling as you would expect. And maybe this is what we can also find back in the 13th century, which might explain why there is no famine and no failed harvests in Central and Eastern Europe at that time. A bit speculative, I have to admit, but there are these parallels, and maybe it explains what we find in the 13th century.
Yeah, yes. In your paper, The Double-Headed Eagle, Richard of Cornwall and Grain from Alamein, you note that the grain was exported to England through Lübeck on the Baltic coast of what is now Germany. Please, can you explain the relationship between Richard of Cornwall, Lübeck, and grain.
Lübeck is kind of considered a key hub for grain trade. And obviously, this grain is not coming from the surroundings of Lübeck, but must come from the Baltic Sea, must come from inland Central Europe, from today's East Germany, from Poland, maybe from the Baltic states. And England, which is severely hit in this the second half of the 1250s, and actually London is starving. And there is this grain import organized by Richard of Cornwall, the brother of the English king, who was at the time king of Germany. And he has quite good connections to Lübeck merchants. And this is really at a very, to my understanding, this is at the very beginning of what later develops into the Hanseatic League. And Lübeck, of course, is a key player in this. They don't have a dominant position with England before, but that starts to change around 1257 when we can have evidence that they have contacts. Also, Richard of Cornwall himself has contacts. He brokers agreements between his brother, the king, and the city of Lübeck. And I would say in this wake of this eruption and the famine, which is very pronounced in England, we have a situation where a lot of grain ships arrive from the continent, and probably, I would say, from Lübeck, and save a lot of English lives in this specific situation.
That is fascinating that a volcanic explosion in Indonesia can shift economics and international relations in Central Europe. Potentially, grain grown in Poland was being exported through Gdansk, round the corner into Lübeck, and then on to England. And it wouldn't have happened if there had not been famine, real hunger in Western Europe, caused by bad weather, which was potentially caused by the volcano in Indonesia.
I would say maybe it would have happened anyway, but why does it start in this year?
Yes.
So basically,
absolutely.
The volcano is not changing anything structurally, but it provokes a situation of emergency where you look for new areas to get your food from. Normally, England was exporting grain. It was not importing grain. That's unusual for the English. They're just not used to that. You see it very clearly because there's documentation from Norway. They get their grain from England in the normal times. And not in these years, it's not possible. And they also go for Lübeck, and they explicitly say, we want to have grain as usual from you because you have it.
Yeah, and I suppose it shows some form of socio-political concern on behalf of the royalty to import grain to alleviate their people's hunger.
Which is very unusual for the time for any European monarchy north of the Alps, because normally, well, it's not the job, it's not the duty of the king to make sure your subjects are not starving. This is different if you look to Italy as well. And then, of course, you have these city-states, and they have citizens who really expect their government to take care of them, not to let them starve. And if government fails, then there will be an uprising. So we have a first, evolvement of these grain security institutions in these city-states around 1260. So probably as a reaction to a massive problematic situation which they faced. And north of the Alps, it's so different. Of course, you have alms, you have charity by monasteries, could be also by a king in a specific situation, but nobody expects this really. So grain security institutions, public granaries, all that is developing in England, in the empire, in the 1440s, not before that. In Italy, it's 200 years earlier. And all the more unusual is the fact that this Richard of Cornwall even cares if Londoners are starving. But he does, but he's not creating a tradition. It's not becoming a regular thing. There are more famines, other severe famines in the 14th century, but that massive import of grain is not really the royal duty. So it's unusual.
When I think back, I realise that England has more storage places for money, banks, than they ever had storage places for grain, granaries. There is something very strange about the English. Today, in periods of famine, people typically will move to urban centres where they are more likely to get food, or today, humanitarian aid. In the late 1250s, was there much migration in search of food? And if so, where did people go? And was it short or long-term migration?
Well, documentation is not very good on it, but I think we can say two things. There are both kinds of migration, a short-term and a long-term one. The short-term migration we know best for this specific period, indeed from London. There has been the discovery of a mass grave Spitalfield cemetery and with hundreds of skeletons, and these have been analyzed, roughly dated into the middle of the 13th century. These skeletons have been identified with the victims of that famine, which we find so prominently in English chronicles. And interestingly, the skeletons were mainly younger people, not children, really young men and women in their 20s and their 30s. It seems as if, and this is also written in chronicles, that a lot of people from the countryside come to London in the hope for more food. But unless they were lucky with the grain brought in from the Baltic Sea, they seem to have starved there. If you compare that to the situation in Italy, it's probably comparable, but these city-states are more capable of providing food. So on the one hand, they also give a preference to their own citizens and try to exclude foreigners, criminals, socially marginalized groups. They are excluded from that access to the communal grain storage. So this is the short-term migration, and I think we can assume people went back to the countryside once the situation was over and they were still alive. The long-term migration is more difficult to trace, but maybe also more interesting for the Central European situation, because we don't have much information on it, but at least two chronicles from Germany or from the empire at that time mention that there is in the early 1260s or around 1260, there's migration to Hungary and to Silesia. There's not a lot of information in this. We know, of course, about this movement, colonization process, Central European settlers or German, Flemish, whatever, coming to different parts of Eastern Central Europe, but we cannot put dates on this so easily. And there we have something which is at least chronologically very close. And if it's true what we assume, that these regions were less hit or not hit at all, there's, of course, another good reason to go. Probably this relates to it, but information is not very detailed.
I can see your concern on the time delay, but to pick up everything and move long term takes a lot of push factors. It would probably take 2, maybe 3 years of really bad harvest to get people to move to a completely new region.
So this might have been one of the push factors in this situation. And of course, this is not contradicting all the other research result on the pull factors, the liberty you had, the possibilities you had, of course. But there must also be a reason you want to leave in a specific situation.
We've talked quite a bit already about the economic impact of the bad weather, which was caused by the volcano, almost certainly. Were there other impacts in terms perhaps of culture or public health?
Well, yes, there were. It's a long discussion in environmental history. If you really want to connect cultural phenomena with environmental change, then it can be tricky. But maybe I can start on the health issue. There is a series of epidemics in the aftermath of these famines. You have a famine, people are malnourished, and of course they're more prone to infectious diseases. It's not surprising, but in the very beginning, I also mentioned that what the volcano emitted into the atmosphere is not just sulfur, but also halogens, so brome and chloride. There has been a discussion among the geochemists if such an injection of these elements into the stratosphere would probably result in a depletion of the ozone layer for some time at least. And it's very hard to tell. The specific characteristic of the Samalas eruption is that you have these halogens as part of the eruption. But this is very speculative. What we can find is indeed a strange synchronicity of epidemic outbreaks in England, in France, in Italy, all in the around Easter 1259. And this is obviously not the usual infectious disease or the epidemic wave going through. So it's happening in the same week in distant regions. And it could be that if we assume there was some reduction of the ozone layer, then higher UV radiation would somehow reduce immune systems of people. But it's speculative, as I said. So the cultural thing is also speculative. So I looked for this very long, and you mentioned, or we talked about the situation with the grain imports of Richard of Cornwall to England. And maybe one cultural thing which is quite surprising to me is the following. There's a long research history on when the Roman Germanic kings got this coat of arms with the double-headed eagle for the first time. And it's not easy to answer. The first time we ever see it for a Roman Germanic king, not for an emperor, but for a king, is surprisingly Richard of Cornwall. And then I looked into archaeological finds, and there is something at first sight very boring. Metallic weights for balances you would use at the market for bulk goods like grain, for example. And they have coat of arms on them, and there are a lot of them, about 60 of them found in England, and there is always a double-headed eagle and the coat of arms of Richard of Cornwall on the other side. So somehow related to him. And why is he using the double-headed eagle on such an object? Well, it's related to trade, it's related to grain, it's somehow related to the Hanseatic League, these counterweights. So maybe, but this is my speculation on it. He takes so much pride into importing grain in that specific situation and helping English people not to starve, that he tries to connect that with his reign, with the grain trade, with his good relations to Lübeck and other cities. The double-headed eagle after that disappears and is not showing up for another century. So it's kind of an English invention, not jumping back to the continent until Sigismund in 1429, I think. So maybe this is somehow related to that grain situation. And in the background, in the very far background, you see the volcano. You see how difficult my argumentation gets. As I'm talking, I realize how speculative it is, but I published on it and the reviewers didn't reject it as completely nonsense. So.
No, I think that's quite reasonable. It is a glorious image as well. A creature that was looking both ways, east and west. It's proud, noble image.
Disappearing again. And the poor Richard of Cornwall wasn't very successful with it, because when he was assisting his brother in the baronial revolution, and yet had this battle between the English king and the barons at Lewes in 1263, when Richard is captured by the enemy side, he's hiding in a grain mill, and according to contemporaries, they are singing derisive songs about him when he has to get out of the mill, and they call him the royal miller, get out of that mill. So in a way, people were not fully appreciating his efforts in grain imports. So
no, the English are never very polite about their rulers. It's part of our tradition, I think. For my final question, I actually would like to look at the modern day a little bit, and compare it to the medieval period. We see major events now having impacts in other places. I mean, we can see the invasion of Ukraine has caused, at least temporarily, hunger, food shortages in Central Africa. Medieval Europe was less intertwined than we are, But how would you summarize the impact of this global moment, the volcanic eruption, and medieval Europe?
That's a big question for the end of this interview. But of course, why do I put such a lot of effort in trying to reconstruct and understand what this volcano did or did not? So I think there's a concurrence of interpretations in environmental history. So is this a key event of the 13th century that really changes the course of history? And paleoclimatologists have argued that maybe this is the first big eruption, then there are some more in the 13th century. Altogether, this might be something like a trigger to what we know as the cooling of the Little Ice Age. So temperatures obviously are going down in the beginning of the 14th century, and large volcanic eruptions could change global weather patterns and climate if they will repeat within some decades. So this is the maximalist interpretation. This is a key event. Oh, but you might have heard from my argumentation, it's very hard to see this big rupture. I'm not speaking for even for the climate, it's not so easy, but also for societies. There are other colleagues who argue, well, look, the volcano is nice, but chronology is so difficult, and obviously all these failed harvests start a little bit before the conventional dating of the volcano in 1257. So probably the volcano is not so important. There is some climatic disturbance before that already. Might be, or maybe the dating of the volcano is not final. That is my argument, which I don't want to go into details here because it touches upon a lot of disciplinary assumptions, and dendrochronologists get very angry, some of them at least. They are really the uncrowned kings of paleoclimatology because they have annual precise dating. And if you doubt this, and I don't doubt it, but probably I talk to other colleagues from that field and they say, well, we don't know precisely, and there might be some change. So dating is very, very important. Although it's good to keep in mind that not everything is triggered and explained by the volcano, and the impact can be very different from region to region. And what I think we can surely see is that medieval societies are much more resilient than we think. So they're not collapsing. Nobody is collapsing at that time, really. There are people who suffer and pay with their life. They are resilient, of course, at a price which we as modern societies wouldn't be willing to pay. We wouldn't be willing to pay thousands of starved people. But the societies go on. But yeah, I mentioned the Mongols. There's a big discussion because from the Mongol history, these years 1258, 1260 are quite interesting. You see the capture of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. Then shortly later, the Mongol advance to Egypt is stopped by the Mamluks. And around 1260, the empire, the large Mongol empire, breaks up into 4 separate parts. The Ilkhanate in the Middle East, the Golden Horde, the Yuan Empire with Kublai Khan, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. But connecting this political process with an environmental impact, colleagues have tried it, and it's not fully convincing. We don't really see the mechanism where this would contribute. So probably maybe a coincidence. And again, coming back to the impact in Europe, I think locally this can be an important point, but you have to become very locally to argue like that. So the historians of Bologna have said, hey, the famine around 1260, that's really the turning point for our city's history in the 13th century, because before that we were on the rise, and then problems start. This works for one city, but it doesn't work everywhere. So that's why I come back to this idea of this global moment or a global event. It's not saying necessarily that this is really a game changer to affected societies, but it's something that most, or if not all, contemporary societies in some way were affected, and maybe only affected because they see strange behavior of the sun or rain or precipitation changing. this is something to be interpreted by them. And they have to find a cultural explanation. They have to, if they're economically affected, they have to adapt to some extent, or to strengthen adaptation processes that were already on the way. So crane security wasn't invented because of the volcano, but of course it was a good moment to get to the next step, to look for new import areas. And this is, for example, what Venice and Genoa did after 1260. They were formalizing their imports from southern Italy in the wake of this event. So they were clearly looking for a diversification of their grain imports. And this goes on until the Black Death. From famine to famine, they spent their networks. Yeah, but my idea is that this global moment allows for not for one aspect that is important, but for a handful of these changes that might be accelerated or initiated by the experience somehow connected to the volcanic eruption. But certainly we don't have a disastrous rupture and not really a turning point, but we have something where we can compare how do societies in Japan cope with that religiously compared to the flagellants in Perugia. For obviously, it's a crisis situation for both of them, and religious reform movements are initiated specifically in these years. So that's what's interesting to me. That the connection that I see is, if you want to say it like that, is the volcanic aerosol, which has different effects in different places, but roughly at the same time. That's what I would say that's a global moment of the Middle Ages, and that's why I think the Samalas is worth spending your time on.
Yes, I can see how the Samalas eruption is totally absorbing to unpick all those impacts, both direct and indirect, that create a global moment in the Middle Ages. Absolutely fascinating. Martin, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our listeners have as well. It's been brilliant, really informative and enjoyable. Thank you for coming on to the MECERN podcast.
Thank you for inviting me and giving me the chance. And also a historian of Eastern Central Europe is, of course, a great occasion to break that old narrative, that also the negative narrative, because obviously Eastern Central Europe in these kind of situations is a privileged region and can really give something to the rest of the continent. But grain is important. So, hey.
Yeah, grain is very, very important. It's, it underpins everything. And we see that even today.
Yep.
And on that interesting note, we must finish it there. Martin, thank you for talking about the global moment of medieval history. And my thanks to everyone else for listening. I hope you found it as interesting and informative as I did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which we talk to MECERN members and associates about their recent or ongoing research into medieval Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you would like to talk about it to other MECERN members, please do contact me through the MECERN board or website administrator. I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.